Salve Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix, Salve Porta, ex mundo lux extorta, Gaude Virgo gloriosa, superam.
We're going to hear from first Neil Freeman, then from Father Damien. I will read excerpts from Christopher Buckley's book and comment briefly on them. And then Clark Judge has agreed to finish out the conference, who knew both Bill and Chris very well, also a Reagan White House speechwriter. And we'll start with Neil. And Neil gave me a 1,000-word biography. But if I could hit some of the Buckley high points. The first producer of Firing Line, managed the Buckley for Mayor campaign in New York City, syndicated Bill's newspaper column for many years, and served 3 different tours as an NR columnist. Neil, thank you so much for jumping into the breach. Mr. Neil Freeman.
Second is Jay Buckley still here? Or did he bail? There he is. I was heartened by the news that you have forgiven your cousin Christo. I tried to pass on that heartening news, but found that he has entered the witness protection program. So we'll have to wait for that. I also want to salute my old friend Lee Edwards. Is he still around?
Yes, he is.
That was a masterpiece this morning. The rest of you, it would be a base temptation to compare my remarks with his. So resist it. It's an obligation. Let me begin by refuting the canard spreading through this conference that I am here under false pretenses. Not true. I am an Episcopalian, which is to say that I'm here under real pretenses. Indeed, according to a recent survey conducted by the Gallup organization, I may not be just an Episcopalian, but the Episcopalian. I thought of presenting myself as a kind of anthropological exhibit, if you want. But let me note, and here I pander as E.J. Dionne instructed us to do last night, in this transparent, pathetic plea for absolution. I have a Catholic wife, I have 3 Catholic children, I have 8 Catholic grandchildren, and that is more than most Catholics have done for you any time. I was introduced to the woman who would become my Catholic wife, of course, by Bill Buckley. It was part of his indefatigable campaign to enlist me in the legions of Rome. Every few years, for a half-century, he would inquire, "Mon vieux, are you still an Episcopal stalwart?" I would reply that I was. He would respond in a pained tone, "Oh, I see." As if he had been reminded yet again that my ignorance was indeed invincible. If I am not licensed then to discuss the Catholic Buckley, let me say a few words about the universal and apostolic Buckley. To begin with, he was my best friend. I hasten to add that I was not his best friend. Over the years, I heard him describe 12 different men as his best friends. There were undoubtedly others who went uncounted. He had this enormous talent for the making and keeping of friendships. So much so that I often thought he made of his life a work of art. This special gift, by the way, ran in the Buckley family. And here I will open a linen drawer. Back in 1976, Bill had dispatched me on a secret mission. His brother Jimmy was running for re-election to the Senate, and Bill anticipated a rough and tumble contest. The early Democratic favorite was the ferocious Bella Abzug. I was then running a journalistic organization, and Bill asked me to prepare an Oppo research report on Jimmy, a catalog of all the mudballs an unrestrained candidate might be tempted to throw at the sainted Jimmy Buckley. We beavered away and came up with this very thick file. No drugs, no women, no scams, no unsavory connections, no funny money, no domestic incidents, nothing at all to excite my staff gumshoes. It appeared that Jimmy's criminal career had peaked when he ripped one of those tags off the mattress. Strong evidence that Jimmy had served as best man at 5 different weddings. I was stunned by what I regarded as this world-class performance in the Friendship Olympics. Bill found it unremarkable. Everybody was good at making friends, weren't they? And so it went unremarked. Bill was, of course, a man of several parts, a writer, an editor, a controversialist, a fully formed Christian man, a mentor to some of us here, plus some of us not here, Mr. Dolan. I was once asked about Bill's mentoring and responded that if the term were not usefully employed elsewhere, I would describe his approach as the Heimlich maneuver. He pushed, he cajoled, he demanded that you produce your best work. And when you did, he was boyishly delighted. And he promoted you shamelessly to all of his well-connected friends. It's perhaps less widely recognized that he was an organizational genius of sorts, a great talent scout, a prodigious fundraiser, a builder of movements and institutions. We used to joke about how hard it was to change the world, even if you happened to be Bill Buckley. You would say of his budding conservative enterprise, we have 200 absolutely essential jobs to be done, and only 20 people to do them. Bill's solution to that managerial challenge was typically elegant. He announced one day that we would all do 10 jobs each. There would have been some grumbling in the ranks, but for the fact that Bill took on all of the toughest jobs himself. My own experience was not untypical of the young idealists who gathered around him. When RKO offered him a weekly television slot, he said, "Great, and Neil will produce the show." And that's how I got into television. And when the old Washington Star offered him a syndicated column, he said, "Great, and Neil will edit the column." And that's how I got into the newspaper business. And when the Conservative Party offered him its nomination for mayor of New York, he said, "Great, and Neil will run the campaign." And that's how I got into politics. You will have discerned in this anecdote one of Bill's most conspicuous and charming flaws, his naive and redundantly misplaced confidence that his friends were as omnicompetent as he. As I say, my experience was not at all unique. The man you were scheduled to hear in my place today may have owned, Tony Dolan, of course, may have owed at least 1 or 2 of his own careers to Bill. And there are many more of us, friends of Bill, salted across American media, the academy, the political world, and I would hope the church. Not a one is a time server or a clock watcher. They are all each in his or her own way still trying to change the world. Bill picked his friends with care. My own good fortune then was to be the guy standing next to Bill Buckley when he became Bill Buckley. In 1963, he was a gifted polemicist in the world of the small magazine. After the column, the campaign, and the launch of Firing Line, he was only a few years later, 3 or 4, a commanding figure on the national scene. Let me leave you with 2 stories. The first about Bill Buckley, and the second about Pat Buckley, who's got some bad press lately. I hope these stories will suggest why I found it to be irresistible people. Some years back, my good Catholic wife gave me the best Christmas present I ever received, a copy of my own FBI file. I don't know if this lacuna still exists, but at the time, under some obscure provision of the FOIA Act, Freedom of Information, you could obtain a redacted copy of anything the Bureau had bothered to remember about you. Included in this so-called raw file were transcripts of agent interviews conducted during field audits, those very elaborate inquiries into the suitability of candidates for federal appointment. These files made for fascinating reading. All of the interviewees had been sworn to secret and to tell the truth, but at the same time they had been promised permanent confidentiality. Imagine yourself, the raw file indeed. Everything comes out. Well, come Christmas morning, I read through what I immediately recognized as Bill's interview, though redacted, complete with the agent's misspelling of mutatis mutandis. I came to the final omnibus fanny covering question. Agent, would I, candidate Freeman, be likely to embarrass the administration? Replied witness Buckley under oath, I should think that the reverse is much more likely. And now a word about the luminiferous Mrs. Buckley. To those of us who knew her in the 60s, she was Patsy. By the 70s, when she was emerging as a powerhouse fashionista, she was Pat. And by the 80s, when she had become an arbiter, some would say the arbiter, of cosmopolitan taste and trend, she was always the chic and stunning Pat Buckley. Chic and stunning Pat Buckley, excuse me. She of the first 3 names. That should be 3 first names. I once asked if I might call her Chic for short. Down through the decades, Patsy had been a constant presence at National Review board and editorial dinners. Her custom was to descend the staircase of the maisonette after her guests had gathered in the foyer. She would make the entrance grande and then perambulate, working her way around the room with a witty word and an air kiss for each of us. We would then go into dinner, Patsy hosting one table, Bill the other. During the first course, Bill would rise from his seat, move around the tables, and hand out slips of paper. These were after-dinner speaking assignments. On one memorable evening, my slip read simply, "After Henry." I didn't recall meeting anybody named Henry at the reception, so I looked around the tables and saw sitting next to Patsy a man who looked very much like Henry Kissinger. I should add a bit of context here. It's important to understanding that Bill wasn't just levitated in his career by this waft of good feeling and brilliant insights. It was a tough struggle to get to the top of the mountain. And there were little elbows and knees action along the way. Until he mellowed with his fame of the 70s, and even more so with the political prosperity of the 80s, Bill Buckley's dinners could be tough and edgy affairs, the site of forensic combat on the British public school line. It was a way, as Bill once said, to separate the women from the girls. And indeed, some young editors and directors failed to survive this ordeal. and were quickly airbrushed from institutional memory. Excuse the apostrophe, back now to the night in question. We finished Patsy's magnificent dinner. Beef Wellington it frequently was in those days. Bill tapped his wine glass and then introduced our special guest, instructing him crisply to crystallize his thoughts on the international situation. We all enjoyed it when Bill would instruct princes and presidents, and they would almost always meekly comply. It was wonderful. I think it's called command presence. Well, Henry Kissinger got to his feet and began to unwind this sweeping tour d'horizon, a fully Kissingerian presentation, weaving historical, military, and economic aperçus in this fine geostrategic tapestry. As he did so, I sat staring glumly at my slip of paper. A young NR director whose knowledge of foreign affairs might charitably be described as cursory. A young NR director praying that God, even a Catholic God, might breathe a little inspiration my way. Kissinger concluded to thunderous applause, and just as I rose to speak, Patsy Buckley said in that voice that could cut through harbor fog, "Henry, you're making no sense at all. My God, we've got Neil here to straighten this all out." Only my Episcopalian genes restrained me from bounding across the room and kissing her sloppily on the face. As you will appreciate, Patsy Buckley was the kind of woman who could inspire devotion. And in Bill Buckley's case, that devotion was inspired until death did them part. Bill was, in equal measure, devoted to his son Christopher, to his many best friends, to his beloved country. To those close to him, however, what was most striking of all was his devotion to his church. I traveled with him in 5 different decades, and I can report that while he could not always be relied upon to find a decent restaurant or an hygienic restroom or a surgeon who spoke English, he could always find a place to profess his faith. On a rocky coast, in an urban hellhole, even in a communist wasteland, wherever his travels took him, he would identify some semblance of the church outpost and make his pilgrim's way there to worship his Savior. I leave it to you licensed professionals to determine whether Bill Buckley was a good Catholic. What I can say with authority is that for the rest of us, he made Catholicism look resplendently good.
Father Damien Kearney is the longtime head of the English department at the Portsmouth Abbey School. He is a 1945 graduate of the school and a Yale contemporary of Bill Buckley's, and he will, having taught both E.J. Dionne and Christopher Buckley, speak briefly about Bill at Yale and Christopher here. Father Damien. Or perhaps not.
Well, it's really Bill at Yale and Bill here.
Okay.
And not Christopher. I will allude to Christopher too. About an hour ago, I got the message that I was to sort of fill in this way.
I know I gave you too much time. I apologize.
How much time did you think about to do this paper?
Before I begin, I'd like to say my own first meeting with Mrs. Buckley. She came to a parents' weekend reception, and she came up to me and said, "I am the Buckley who is not contributing to the population explosion." And I had subsequently received a very, very funny letter from her, which I'll not quote. What I'm talking about is Bill Buckley at Yale and on some of his visits to Portsmouth. some while his son was here and some subsequently. What I'm going to say too is going to be random notes for highlights really from an article which I wrote, which was much more coherent, much more logically presented. So I didn't have the time really to really assemble my thoughts in a proper way. So I've just got sort of highlights, random notes. Anyway, 2 weeks ago, I was at a reception given at the Catholic Center of Yale for the birthday of a former headmaster's wife, Mr. John Wilkinson, John Wilkinson. His wife was celebrating her 70th birthday. It was a very happy occasion, and a number of us went down for it. But while we were waiting for the concert to begin, one of the bookstores on the campus we were visiting had a large display of books by Bill Buckley, as well as a large supply of Christopher's latest book. The book that I noticed especially of Bill's was The God and Man at Yale. So, and as well as other books of his that have been published rather more recently. His presence is still something to be reckoned at his alma mater. He lived just above me in Davenport College. His brother also was a member of Davenport College. His musical tastes were apparent because he had a piano in his suite, and luckily I liked the kind of music that he played. I'm glad he did not like the Beatles that we had heard about last night. Another member of the college at that time, although not living on campus, was George Bush, Sr., and he had just married Barbara, and so he was not allowed to be on campus. He had to live off campus. If he had gone to Princeton, he would not have been allowed to be at Princeton because they did not accept married undergraduates. So luckily he was there. But of course their paths were to intersect much more closely later on. He had a tremendous impact, Bill did, on the undergraduates while I was there, and even faculty, as well as undergraduates, talked about what he was going to say each time he did an editorial, and that was every day, for the Yale Daily News. This job was an extremely important and influential, demanding job. Demanding because of the pressure of meeting deadlines constantly, and it was a perfect preparation for his later syndicated columns. I can't emphasize too much, though, the impact that he had on the whole undergraduate body. Everybody talked about him, everybody was aware of his opinions, and he was never afraid or ashamed to express exactly what was on his mind. When he was here on a visit on one occasion, he asked me where he could find a typewriter to write his column and phone it in. This was long before the computer and email revolution. He only had an hour before he had to give a graduation address, so he was doing several things at once. He was probably figuring out what he was going to say too at the graduation. I don't think so, because he later, we did have a copy of that, which we printed in a bulletin shortly thereafter, and he was a sesquipedalian, definitely. And one of the words that they used constantly in his obituary, every single possible arcane word that he could possibly use, he used. One of the professors while I was in college taught a highly popular sociology course, and he was a favorite target of Buckley and his editorials, and he deals with this in his book, God and Man at Yale. This professor made a point of criticizing the Catholic Church constantly. Every opportunity that he could, he would do so. And this was enough to arouse Buckley's ire. Constantly, he rebutted him, brought him out, and attacked him in his editorials. I took that course, though. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot from it, and simply ignored the jabs at my religion, which is what most other Catholics who were attending that course did. At the time, there was, of course, a very strict quota of Catholics at Yale. They were never allowed to be more than 10%. 10% Catholics, 10% Jews. So not many really Catholics were affected by what he said. The Catholic chaplain, however, was delighted with somebody like Buckley to defend the faith and to put Catholicism on the Yale map. That's exactly what Buckley did. That was what his tremendous contribution to his religion was while he was at Yale. I might say that this situation of Catholicism at Yale has changed radically under Mr. Levin, who is himself a Jew, but has been most kind to Catholics at Yale and has allowed the new Catholic Center to be on property which belongs to Yale at the rate of $1 a year rent. So he has encouraged Catholicism. And Catholicism, too, has come a long way in the fact that it now has a Catholic chaplain of the university, and the dean of the divinity school is a Roman Catholic, and the Catholic chaplain, incidentally, is a woman. So Yale must be still, the forebears of Yale must be reeling in their graves at such a change. They are about 25 to 30% now Catholic instead of the 10% that when Bill and I were there. When it came time for Bill to select a school for his son, Christopher, it was Portsmouth over his own school, Millbrook, largely because of his friendship with the Van Winkle family. His mother was a close friend of Bill's mother, and he was also a great friend of his son, Don Leo, who was the headmaster of Portsmouth, a great personal friend. He was the Catholic and the academic quality character that he valued over facilities, because at that time, to say that Portsmouth was Spartan would be the greatest of understatements. It was the most primitive place as far as buildings and facilities go. But Bill was blind to that, fortunately for us, because Christopher turned out to be an extremely valuable person in his subsequent career, and largely from his gaining what he did from the Portsmouth experience. So it was the Catholic and the academic character which was of first importance to him. The only impressive building that we did have was, in fact, St. Bennett's, which was built of brick. Everything else was clapboard, and it was most of those buildings now have incidentally been torn down. The English character was what he was glad to see at Portsmouth, which had been started by Dr. Bateman, himself an English headmaster from the 1930s, and that gave really Portsmouth its very sort of English character, emphasizing sports as character building and extending the curriculum into music, lectures, and cultural pursuits, as well as the academic side. He also introduced prefects and prize days and things like that. Anyway, all of this was appealing. So on one occasion, when Bill, Chris, and some friends came for a retreat, he brought with him his own retreat master, relying on that rather than on one of the monks here. That was incidentally Father Rutler, who gave us our first talk at this series. One of the monks observed him reading the New York Times in our calefactory during one of the times when he was not engaged in the retreat. And this monk expressed surprise at seeing him read such a newspaper as the New York Times. His instant reply, though, was that he was looking for heresy. One endearing quality that was apparent in his behavior at the time he came to speak at the graduation of his nephew and namesake, William, was during his attendance at a recital of one of the graduating students. This senior had a special independent study project, which took the form of constructing a harpsichord and then playing the piece before the parents at graduation. Well, in the audience, Bill was present, and at the end of the recital that the boy gave, he asked if he could try out the instrument, and he promptly played a selection, which was the delight of the parents, and especially the student, who treasured that memory and still treasures it, because I spoke to him on a recent reunion when he was here, and he still remembers that occasion very fondly. Indeed, it was the highlight of his senior year. But it's the kind of thing that Bill could do, which was very, very affecting to those who were recipients of his kindness. One of the many acts of kindness and generosity that we've heard referred to in other lectures. Getting to Christopher, while he was here at the school, on one occasion, he lived in St. Venice, and I was housemaster at the time. I found him reading a copy of Playboy magazine, indeed that very article that was referred to in this morning's lecture, which I've never read. I'd like to read it someday just to see what it was. Anyway, it was a forbidden, Playboy was a forbidden magazine in those days, and we were ordered as housemasters to confiscate any copies if they surfaced. So I was all set to do just this when he defended himself by pointing to the article written by his father. Well, needless to say, I could not take the magazine away, but I did put on his honor not to read anything else. There was one other occasion when Bill was here visiting his son for Parents' Day, when I happened to be the preacher for the Sunday Mass. And I alluded to the mistaken idealism that had prompted students at Columbia to take over the administration building. Incidentally, at the same time, we had two members of our faculty who had the previous year occupied the Harvard administration building, but they had gotten over their rebellious behavior and were very good, outstanding members of our faculty at Matt White. Two of three principal rebels of these ones who took over the administration building were Portsmouth alumni. And it was to our horror that we saw their faces on the front page of the New York Daily News the next day after the event had occurred. Anyway, I alluded to that in my sermon. After the Mass, he mentioned to me that he liked what I had said, but I was quite wrong, and perhaps too charitable, to ascribe idealism as the reason for their behavior. It was the work of radicals and revolutionaries attempting simply to overthrow society. Well, it probably was just that, but it was not really part of their true character. And I'm sure that, in fact, I know that they did eventually get over it. This was part of the scene of the 60s, and it affected most college campuses at the time. It's a sign of the times to express this sort of act of rebellion. Eventually, most of them have come back into society, having sown their wild oats, and some of them indeed became very good, respectable, conservative Republicans. I'd like to end with this quotation from a writer who, this comes actually from the Yale Alumni Magazine, and it was a quotation, this is a quotation from Jeff Greenfield. Some of the people probably know that Colin is a very good writer, and I think he became a good friend of Bill's. Anyway, Buckley had come up to Yale in order to debate with Bill Coffin, who graduated a class before Buckley. In fact, he was in my own class. And I was invited to speak at a reunion, a Yale reunion, with the two of us as chaplains. Well, needless to say, bowed out. Coffin was something of a radical preacher, and he and I would never have sort of seen eye to eye, so I decided wisely perhaps not to lend myself to the occasion. Anyway, he gives this verbal portrait, and it's such a good description of Bill Buckley that it could be said of him at any time, I think, in his life. Well, the occasion was the Princeton weekend set has been struck. Well, in its place, it is the community of scholars, the marketplace of ideas. Today is the cerebral confrontation, that clash of minds celebrated by every alumni magazine that tries to explain to the apoplectic grads why the Socialist Club burned an American flag at halftime over national television. Today, the Reverend William Sloane Coffin Jr. debates William F. Buckley Jr. One participant appears prematurely. It's 4 p.m. on Chapel and York Streets, across from the Art and Architecture Building, a depressing street with a shoe repair shop, a third-rate luncheonette, and a pornographic bookstore. That's incidentally all changed. 2 weeks ago I was on that very street, and is quite respectable. But suddenly, striding up York Street is where Davenport College is an undergraduate flush with excitement. There on his left is a man of incontestable assurance. He is put together entirely of angles, high cheekbones, cutting inward to a sharp chin, a Roman nose, private school hair combed straight across a high forehead, and the most dexterous pair of eyebrows in the world. He is chatting animatedly with his companion, the eyebrows gesturing as forcefully as a Kennedy forefinger, the mouth pursing, exploding, collapsing again. One wonders if William F. Buckley Jr. notices the weary character of the street. One doubts it. Thank you.
Christopher Buckley and I met here at Portsmouth in 1966 and have been friends ever since. So when Christo realized he had committed contractually to speaking in Denver today, he asked me to stand in for him here. My first direct encounter with Bill Buckley was when I was assigned to wait on his and Pat's table at Parents' Weekend. As I poured out some of Father Peter the Cellarer's best claret, Bill offered his water glass and said, "Fill that one up too." And then did the same with his coffee cup. And then he did the same with Pat's drinking vessels. Bill changed many people's lives profoundly, and mine as well. When he later came to speak at the school, he observed that boarding school food had not changed since he was at Millbrook. But I have a clear memory of Bill's evident devotion at Mass here at Portsmouth, as well as on every occasion I saw him in church, just as you did, and I suppose those images in my mind helped lead to choosing this year's conference title, 40 Years On. In prefacing a reading from Losing Mum and Pup, I really cannot fail to mention Patricia Taylor Buckley, who descended on Father Leo, the then headmaster, in her then stunning chic wardrobe of North African pajamas, and demanded that Christopher be moved from his lodgings under Father Damien and St. Bennett's to somewhere more suitable. The breakers would do quite nicely, thank you. Years later, when then a grad student at Cambridge, I thought to economize by spending the week before Christmas on an in-tourist trip to Moscow and Leningrad. Whom did I meet but the Buckleys leading the National Review staff through the Kremlin? Jamie, Pat demanded in her timid way, how dare you come to Moscow without a proper overcoat? You go buy one this very afternoon. Which would have been an inspired suggestion, and not the only thing emptier than the Muscovy shops of that era been my wallet. I'm told the Muscovy shops are doing much better. It wasn't until many years later that the Catholic Pat Buckley revealed herself to me. I was lunching with my brother Pierce near his office at Tiffany when Pat rushed in, stopped quickly to say that she was late to join her party, but that we were on no account to leave the restaurant without coming over after we finished our meal. We did so, and always one who wanted to show that she was up with you. Mrs. Buckley called out, "Jamie, I see that the Pope created 63 new cardinals today." "Well," I answered, "I did read something about that in the paper, but I think the number was 24. Jamie, she said, in her most menacing way at anyone's impudence in contradicting her. There was a nanosecond of tense silence until one of her lunch partners, costume jewelry king Kenny J. Lane, helpfully clarified the situation. No, Pat, dear. There are 63 only if you count their children. I'm quite certain that when Governor Patterson was reported last autumn to be naming someone to replace Hillary Clinton in the Senate, whose uncle had been a senator in New York State, Pat assumed that would be Christopher, not Caroline Kennedy, on a stately progress toward his rightful place in the House of Lords. And though the press has reported how the Kennedys are determined to make Patterson pay for his perfidy, that punishment will pale beside Pat's vengeance. In losing Mum and Pup, Christopher recounts seeing his father for the first time after his mother's death. I went to his study. Pup was red-eyed, puffy-faced, out of breath, in rough shape. He was gradually suffocating from emphysema and had just lost his wife of 5 decades. We embraced. That afternoon, Pup was going to Mass. I said I'd come. Normally I didn't. Normally, when in Connecticut on a Sunday, I would discreetly make myself scarce around this time when we would gather up the Hispanic staff and drive to St. Mary's Church, where a priest would say a private Latin Mass for them. Today, however, I reckoned was not a day to skip church, so I went this day. Pup went throughout the Mass. Afterward, he told a friend who was there that he was so pleased that I had attended. Pup and I had engaged in our own 100 years war over the matter of faith. Our Sturmius and Drangius times were over religion. Pup had the most delicious, reliable, wicked, vibrant sense of humor of anyone I knew, yet his inner Savanova was released at the merest hint, to use his term, of impiety. Finally, exhausted, I adopted, whether hypocritically or cowardly or wisely, a Potemkin stance of being back in the fold. My agnosticism, once defiant, had gone underground. I no longer had the desire to nail my theses to his church door. By now I knew we didn't have much time left, and I didn't want to spend it locking theological horns, making him heartsick with my advantages. When I was younger and periodically confessed to him my doubts about the one true faith, he dealt with it in a fun and enterprising way. By taking me off to Mexico City for 4 or 5 days, during which we would read aloud to each other from G.K. Chesterton's great work of Catholic apologetics, Orthodoxy. We drive up into the hills of Puerto Vaco and Toxco and sit on narrow balconies overlooking the Zacalos, drinking margaritas and reading Chesterton aloud to each other. Not a bad way to restore one's faith, really. 4 or 5 days of this, and I was content to shrug off my doubts about the Immaculate Conception or the Trinity. They were some of the best days I ever had with him. Some months later, Christopher continues. He summoned me one afternoon to his bed and said to me, a look of near despair on his face, "Oh, Cristo, I feel so bloody awful." "I know you do, Pup," I said. "I'm so sorry. I wish, if it weren't for the religious aspect," he said, "I'd take it to him." The religious aspect. Here we were venturing on thin ice. This was not the time to break what remained in his heart by telling him, though I greatly admired the teachings of Jesus, I had long ago stopped believing that he had risen from the dead. But let's contrast that for a moment with the message Christopher sent Bill on his birthday as they sailed the Pacific on Celestial after a couple of years of estrangement, as recounted by Bill joyfully in 1992 in Windfall. Christopher's letter adds, "My prayer, and it will be that, a prayer, will be for you, my dear and beloved Pup." And finally, from the closing of Losing Mum and Pup, yesterday I was driving behind the Belchy City bus on the way back from the grocery store, and suddenly found myself thinking, not for the first time, about whether Pup is in heaven. He spent so much of his life on his knees in church, so much of his life doing the right thing by so many people, a million acts of generosity. I shouldn't use the word dying of curiosity. How did it turn out, Pup? Were you right after all? Is there a heaven? Is Mum up there with you? Grumbling almost certainly about the inedible food. And if there is a heaven and you're in it, are you thinking, poor Cristo, he's not going to make it? And his Mum saying, "Bill, you have to speak to that absurd creature at the gates and tell him he's got to admit Christopher. It's too ridiculous for words." Even in my dreams, they're looking after me. So perhaps one is never really an orphan, after all. Christopher's memory of his parents, memoir of his parents, has received praise and criticism, the latter taking a tasked with filial impiety, making public unflattering details of his parents' declining years. Joan Frawley Desmond, whose brothers Joe and Michael were here at the school in our time, summed up this line of argument by writing in Inside Catholic that Christopher himself had not always behaved well, and that he might have written a better book had he gained the perspective of another 5 years. Christopher's English teacher, Father Damien, dismissed that argument by observing Buckley was smart to write the book now. In 5 years, who would have cared? The book is trenchant, unsparing, but loving, and often hilarious, as in the description of a titled English lady houseguest hanging on as tenaciously as a monomaniacal abalone to Bill's despair, or the recounting of Bill's wish that his and Pat's ashes be entombed forever in a cross that adorned their Stamford lawn, whatever the religious inclination of the house's future owners might be. But ultimately, losing Mum and Pup is also an only child's creed of core, about growing up in what must have often seemed to be a free-ring circus. Many years ago, Christopher once said to me, "I always wondered what country we came from." And of course, what the book leaves out is the many years that Christopher, the name itself, as Father Julian pointed out in his homily at Christopher and Lucy's wedding, means Christ-bearer, was himself a devout Catholic. Certainly during the years in the late 1980s when he collaborated on a play about Queen Elizabeth I and St. Edmund Campion, he was a convinced believer and conscientious practitioner of his faith. At some point, after Campion was produced in 1987, he read a book review that referred to the alleged resurrection of Jesus Christ, and a seed of doubt entered into his mind that is still there. And yet I find it interesting that nearly every other posting he makes to his blog, The Daily Beast, is church-related. And just this Christmas, he FedEx ice cream to the monks of Portsmouth in gratitude for their prayers at his request for a loved one. So Christopher, it seems to me, is on a journey, and whether he follows in the path of Catholic literary sons like Oberon Moore or Wilfred Sheave, or undergoes a new conversion, we cannot know. What I do know is that we, beset as we all are by our own sins and difficulties, must travel beside him on that voyage with love and prayers that he and all of us reach our ultimate safe harbor.
We've heard of this meeting about William Buckley as a man of faith, a man of family, a man of letters, a founder of American conservatism. As a man, a creative man, founded a National Review, Firing Line, wrote innumerable columns, spoke thousands of places. A man, that is, of the creative act. I'd like to talk today, or in summary, I hope, of today, talk about William Buckley, what may have been his central creative act, which was introducing a Catholic sensibility to the main currents of American thought. Now, Catholics have been practitioners of American politics since, in a major way, since the 1840s, the Irish and later the Italians. But Catholic thought in the United States had been largely on the left. And in that sense, was something of a side current. The main currents of American leftist thinking, if you had such, were in progressivism, which was really a Protestant form, came from Protestant circles, and was managerial more than it was leftist. At the time that Bill brought this sensibility to American thought, the American Protestant establishment was losing its confidence in some of the main currents of traditional American political thinking. And through this Catholic sensibility, Bill brought and restored a clarity to American political thought, a clarity about the struggle with communism and its character, a clarity about the moral superiority of the free market, and a clarity about the link of a traditional moral order to the prospects for the next generation and the generation after that and after that of democracy and freedom. In God, let me take those in order about communism. We heard in an earlier speaker some of the criticisms of God, Man, and Jail, and they were, particularly in the context of the times, odious. But there was one thing that was right, that there was underpinning it a Catholic sensibility about the that had been lost to the Protestant establishment, about the existential struggle, not just existential because the two sides had nuclear weapons pointed at one another, but existential because there was a central moral question that struck to the heart of the survival of democracy, the nature of man, and the character of the political system and man in it. Aristotle said that political systems were about creating the happiness of man. Bill Buckley said that is not communism. It is freedom. It is democracy. You can see the strength of his feeling, not just in the arguments he made, but in the contempt that you saw from liberalism, for example, for Eleanor Roosevelt or William Sloane Coffin, not just because of their collectivism, New Deal collectivism, but for the lack of clarity they had about the communist struggle. You can see it in his speeches, which were later printed in several places. This one from Let Us Speak of Many Things, when he took apart Norman Mailer's speech, which was very much emblematic of the thinking of the times outside those who were influenced by the Buckley tradition, or by Buckley's thinking, about an easy attitude towards communism, an easy attitude towards what Buckley characterized as butchery. There was not clarity in America. There was declining clarity in America about the nature of that struggle. Bill Buckley restored that clarity. I should also add that his brother James did as well. The market, let me talk about the market economy. Clarity here started with a sharp understanding of economics itself. You can see it in Unmaking of a Mayor, where he talks about the impending New York bankruptcy, something that nobody else was talking about at the time. And indeed, when that bankruptcy occurred, the word from journalists and commentators alike was, this was absolutely unpredictable, except Bill Buckley had predicted it in 1965. He understood Hayek, he understood Van Mies, he understood Friedman, he understood economics fundamentally, but he brought to it a creative sense of the moral character of the free market. Not just that it was about prices and efficiency, not just that you got better results, but that there was a moral character in those better results. For example, he made the argument that while the left argued about social justice, the free market was the true best source of social justice, the true raiser of all peoples from of all levels. That there was at one point in New York, this is a favorite of mine, though it's a little bit obscure. At one point, there was a lot of talk in the New York media about classical radio being driven out because there was no place for it in the market economy. Bill Buckley responded that, in fact, classical radio was receiving a subsidy from the free market because while its market share in terms of listeners was low, the market share of dollars was much higher, and the difference was a subsidy. In other words, he brought a Catholic sensibility to an economic analysis. This was a creative act that contrasted, for example, with Nelson Rockefeller, who famously in a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev said that if Khrushchev talked about immigrants coming to America for freedom, and Khrushchev replied, no, they came here for jobs, sneering. Nelson Rockefeller had no answer for that. Bill Buckley later took out a Carnegie Hall and responded to Khrushchev and finished his response with, "We will bury you." It was Bill Buckley's understanding that there was a moral sensibility, a moral factor to the free economy that linked freedom and those jobs, that was unique and creative, and that he brought. For me, one of the most emblematic moments of that period was a photo that appeared in Unmaking of America. It showed Abraham Bean making a point, Bean, Lindsay, and Buckley sitting side by side, and he seems lost in his point. And then John Lindsay listening, except he doesn't seem to understand the point that Bean is lost in. And Bill Buckley is there going, totally bored because he understands it and is on to other things. And that was a kind of clarity he brought to American politics. Finally, he brought a clarity about the link of morality, freedom, and democracy. Now, we heard last night that E.J. Dionne, who I like, who's a very decent and good man, nevertheless made a swipe about monarchism. Bill Buckley was a practitioner of American politics. We heard about it from Neil earlier, who understood what American politics was about, and who understood understood the underpinnings of American politics, and far from anything that is in E.J.'s imagination. In the pages of NR, over and over, you read brilliant, sophisticated analyses of the links of the teachings of morality and ultimately of theology to the viability of a political and economic system. We've heard it called fusion, but this was a creative act, and this was Bill Buckley's another of Bill Buckley's contributions to the mainstream of American political thought. And I would say a contribution that reflected, as I say, a Catholic sensibility. Where would America be today without that clarity? Where would we be? Where would the world be? I've spoken to you about all this. I should tell you that we've had many people here who, like Neil, worked with Bill quite a lot, who visited his home. I visited the home in Park Avenue, but I got to know Bill after being presidential speechwriter. I'd met him a number of times before, but got to know him better later. I wasn't helped in my career. I wasn't published. It's later published in National Review Online, but not in National Review. So in a way, I'm speaking to you as what many of you are, who are perhaps Portsmouth alumni, but not friends of Bill. As one who was informed of him and influenced by him through his speaking and his writings, and who was, in that sense, regarded him as a teacher. A teacher really for all of us. And that, I think, his legacy, his greatest legacy, was bringing that sensibility to the American political mainstream. And it's a legacy that endures and will endure, I believe, as long as there's the United States. Thank you.
Sub in silo Dave, et raptorum